So Uranus is entering Gemini. Uranus comes to Gemini on the 7th of July or the 6th of July, depending on your time zone. Huge deal, major transit because of not only the symbolism of Uranus, which is a shocking force of breakage. So anytime Uranus is anywhere in our transiting sky, we have to say, well, where's the shocking breakage applying in our charts and lives and in terms of the historical cycles? But two, the history of it. These particular cycles of Uranus and Gemini have been greatly interesting at a whole host and whole number of levels. And so in this video, we're going to break it down a little bit. And the main thing I want to examine is the idea of technology. And we're going to go deeper, trying to contemplate what it means to have technological breakthrough, what technology is. We're going to look at the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, who I think can speak to this moment uniquely, greater than almost any other voice in our intellectual traditions, as he was sort of a theorist of technology. And we're going to examine the cycle work and look at a few of these big technological breakthroughs to grapple with what we may be about to experience. So stay with me here. My name is S. Anderson, an astrologer. Great to have you on my channel and great to be with you. Uranus and Gemini, the great disruptive bringer of change, is about to announce itself. And of course, with Uranus and Gemini, we need to keep in mind the syncopation of the ingresses, because there's a couple here over the next little bit. Two ingresses into Gemini. The first one, of course, 7 July, UTC. Then Uranus comes back into Taurus on the 8th of November this year. So we get, again, a preview period, a dip into the sign, just like with Neptune, just like with Saturn. I love these because you get to feel into the changes in the new energy, process it, go back and complete the stories of the former sign, in this case Uranus and Taurus, and then fully move ahead into that new energy, having had some time to prepare and think about and process. And then the second ingress of Uranus into Gemini will be 26 April 2026. So we're looking at spring 2026 for the entry without return of Uranus into Gemini. And then of course, finally, it will leave Gemini on the 22nd of May 2033 with a preview period in Cancer in 2032. One thing of note with these is, yes, there's an initial phase, then there's a return, and then a re-entry. But I like to sometimes also think about it, and I've seen that the stories begin upon first ingress. Even if there's a regress back, it's not like the Uranus and Gemini stuff has stopped. We've begun it. We've broken the seal. The cat is out of the bag in a way. It just may take some time to get going, and we're having to complete some of the old stories. So it's more like an overlap period. But the chart example to think about is Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 happened after Uranus had come to Gemini and then gone back into Taurus. Attack happened with Uranus and Taurus, even though the Uranus and Gemini cycle had begun earlier that year. That is all to say that I think we're in that Uranus and Gemini world here in July 2025, and we need to consider it as having begun. You want to start at the level of the symbolic. What is Uranus? What does it imply? What does it mean? What are its significations? What's Gemini? How do we examine the Gemini archetype? Just out of the gate, to lay these things out so we know what we're talking about at the layer of higher level symbolism. Uranus is the great awakener. Falling within the domain of Uranus are things like revolution and invention and technology and things that shock, and electricity, right? The shocking electric surge of information and ideas. If you've been around lightning, I grew up in an area where there were great thunderstorms, and lightning can destroy trees. You're just sitting there and it's thunder, lightning, boom, and whole landscapes are shifted. Fires can break out because of the event of a strike of lightning. Notion of the electric. Electricity allows us to have light, which propels so much in the sense that night doesn't restrict our ability to make and build and do. It's an example of technology, right? Electricity allows for the making and doing and building to extend in all hours of the day. So when we assign that to Uranus, you can see how the innovative containers that Uranus constructs. When you think about electricity, you're thinking about technological advancement in ways that revolutionize what humans are able to engage in day to day. Again, because I say it on almost every video, or at least every time I talk about Uranus, is it's Prometheus. And this is from Richard Tarnas in his book, Cosmos and Psyche, the great text of modern cycle work in terms of outer planet cycle work. Tarnas says that Uranus is Prometheus, which is that you steal the fire, and the gods had fire, and that fire is brought to man. So it's a act of revolution and revolt. Simultaneously, it's an act of radical change that comes through a technology that formerly wasn't in the hands of a person or a group. So I love the Promethean analogy. Oh, it's all built in there. It's all built in there. Gemini. What is Gemini? It's the sign of the twins, a double-bodied sign. The symbolism is 2, meaning that when Uranus brings the shocks and the revelations and the revolutions to Gemini, there can be bifurcation or a splitting that can take place. Reality splitting, group splitting, ruled by Mercury, fleet-footed messenger of the gods, the fast-moving, adaptable Mercury. One thing we have to be thinking about is splitting into multiple worlds, and how the Uranus and Gemini periods often see that. Gemini and other aspects of Mercury include communication and information and networks of travel and all the things when you think about air. Air moves over surfaces quite fast. I'm gonna only say this here once, because this is not a video about Revolutionary War, Civil War, World War II. But when we look at the archetype of Gemini, it's very clear that the splitting, the bifurcation of the twins, which is embedded in the symbol of Gemini, is reflected in the Revolutionary War, where you had a colony breaking free. So there's not 2 countries, Great Britain and America. In the Civil War, the split, when Uranus gets to Gemini, South Carolina secedes, and then you have this new confederacy. It's a split into 2. Uranus, it's like a bolt of lightning that breaks a tree into 2. To come back to the idea of Uranus and a lightning bolt, well, you get this splitting, which is very much of the Gemini archetype. And of course, World War II, the world is split into the Axis and the Allies. In the aftermath of World War II, for so long you had the Cold War and the Iron Curtain. So there was a great splitting into 2 during Uranus and Gemini. But this video is not about that. It's just the notion that the Gemini archetype of splitting is so embodied and evoked in just those last 3 cycles that I wanted to mention it here, and also say we're not going to talk about the war stuff. We all know about the war stuff. War, yeah, global war, war with America. We've all said it. Instead, and this is where we're going to talk about Saturn. So we've talked about Uranus, Gemini, Mercury as the domicile ruler of Gemini, and then now we're going to talk about Saturn as the day triplicity ruler of Gemini. And Saturn is the deep layer of society, the deep structure. The technology then is what's evoked. When you combine all of these things together, Uranus, Mercury, Gemini, and Saturn, you're talking about technological innovation, because technology is what becomes the foundational layer of an age or an era. You have to have the technological breakthrough that then creates deeper containers for society to then build around or structure itself around. Like these darn things. This is now the Saturn of our world. There's that black cube, that black rectangle, that monolith, that Saturnine black mirror that we all stare into, right? It's so embedded and ubiquitous that this is the deep structure, the foundation of the society. But it was a technology once. It was a breakthrough technology, the iPhone. And so that's how Saturn is relevant when talking about technology. As the day triplicity ruler of Gemini, it becomes increasingly relevant to understand the Gemini archetype. Coming back to Uranus and Gemini, some just ideas about the symbolism. You've got revolutionizing the structure of thought and speech. You've got ideas like radical disruption in how humanity communicates, processes information, or constructs its reality. Great leaps ahead for new technological developments of wordplay and word interchange. This is just symbolic delineation here. We're going to come into the cycle work in a second, and we're going to see how these things have been a part of some of the history of Uranus and Gemini. But then we also, and I like this one, the nervous system of society gets rewired. So you can think about all of the world as like a collective nervous system where we're communicating in various ways with other societies and other groups and other people, so that the electric shock of Uranus would somehow rewire or reconstruct the way that this global nervous system might interoperate. Uncanny technologies of connection emerge, so completely new breakthroughs in how information will extend from one being or one society to another. And then this last point, the heretical ideas can often spread at the speed of lightning in societies. You have information spreading fast. What is heretical to the orthodoxy? These are some of the ideas that we're going to see here in the cycle work when we're on the cusp of major technological breakthrough, given Uranus is about to enter Gemini. And I want to come to Martin Heidegger here first, before we look at any of these cycles, because Heidegger, in his famous book or essay, The Question Concerning Technology, that's the English translation, Heidegger wrote in German. But he, in this essay, talks about techne, the Greek word techne, which is the origin of technology. And he says that it didn't mean strictly manufacturing or strictly new tools that we then manufacture with. That techne, actually embedded in it, is the idea of an art or a skill where You use techne to reveal some kind of core essence, poesis, a bringing forth. So these ancient craftsmen, when they used the technologies of their day, it was more about a poetical bringing forth of meaning through a revelation. As an artist, engages in the revelation of meaning through the crafting of works of art. These ideas are embedded in the concept of technology via the word techne from the Greek. The classic analogy, and he uses this, that the sculpture does not impose form on the block. You get the block of clay and you remove clay to see what was already embedded in that block of clay. And so you're using technology to kind of reveal a latent beauty. And so the technology is in service of a kind of becoming of wisdom, beauty, meaning, revelation, art, poetry, etc. And he juxtaposes this with the idea of what he calls framing. And he says that technology at a certain point began to enframe. And basically this is the idea of extracting. So technology then is viewed as just a tool of extraction, where instead of trying to reveal beauty or meaning, you see how that can be extracted into maybe a financialized or in our world, digitized value weighing system. So it's very exploitative in that way. And I think this is the core part of our age. Is this technology going to exploit, extract, demean, undermine, diminish the human spirit? Or will we use technology as a servant of these higher order concepts like the life force or beauty and art and poetry, and revealing the nature of beingness and the awe and the beauty of our humanity? So technology in that way becomes a servant of revelation rather than a system of extraction and diminishment. The idea that the saving power comes from using technology to create art is such an important one to center, I think, as we're on the cusp of Uranus and Gemini, and we're about to have major technological breakthrough, given not only the symbolism of Uranus and Gemini, but then the historical side. Come into this cycle work. I think it's going to get really interesting here. And by the way, this is not an exhaustive list of everything that I could have put in this video. I just wanted to add some core events. The real point of the video is what I've just described. Let's add value and let's add inspiration. The idea of human vibrancy and technology being a servant of that core goal. I'm going to start here in 1439 to 1447. Uranus was in Gemini. The huge breakthrough at this time is amazing, actually, that this would even be a Uranus and Gemini breakthrough, is that Gutenberg invented the printing press. And what we have to understand about the world in which Gutenberg invents the printing press is that texts were sacred and limited before this time. Monks and monasteries would copy texts. It took a long time to create a copy of the Bible, for example. So if you had a copy of the Bible, it was guarded and housed in monastic safes, effectively, and was not widely dispersed amongst people. So knowledge was a commodity that was heavily limited. You juxtapose that with today, I can type in and get anything I want quite fast, and all of these essays are available in PDF, and the world's repository of knowledge is accessible, nearly free for every being on earth now in our phone. But back at this time in the 15th century, that was not the case. The invention of the printing press happens in 1440 roughly, and he synthesized a bunch of technologies, by the way. This was not just some logical next step. He was bringing things like the screw press, metallurgy, oil-based inks into a novel and disruptive system that really shattered the way that information flowed up until that time. And so that's the disruptive and upheaval side of Uranus, clearly evident there. But it created things like mass replication, meaning everybody could read the Bible from here on out. It created things like translations into a vernacular that you could then mass produce, so that people that were ignorant and uneducated masses were suddenly able to read for themselves and grapple with and contemplate ideas that maybe had formerly been deployed as a part of a propaganda matrix to control them. You saw that in Germany. There was a peasants' revolt, and this was in the Uranus and Gemini cycle later, where people were reading the books and were like, hey, and they should have been mad, right? Peasants being mistreated. Martin Luther and the Reformation that came in the 16th century was in Uranus and Gemini for a lot of that, was very much about the consequences of disseminating information en masse to a lot of people that were formerly ignorant. And then when people wake up and realize they're being thrown over a barrel, they get angry. And that's the Uranian trigger and the disruptive, revolutionary side of how Uranus can operate. The idea of a democratization of knowledge, which threatens the ruling structures and overthrows those structures. There's an empowerment of individuals to interpret ideas themselves. So it's like a revolution inside of one's own beingness, where there's a processing of information, new information, and a new type of processing that can release and unleash, the human experience in new ways. The technology spread with incredible speed. By 1500, there were over 200 cities in Europe that had the printing presses, already 20 million volumes produced. And that's another side of the Uranian and the Gemini and the Mercurial, is it just spreads very fast. And it's Saturnine. Often we think Saturn is slow, but Saturn is actually the deep embedding. And so when something can tap into that deep embedding, you can create fast because you've tapped into that core layer. And I think something like the printing press is a great example of that, because it's so foundational, reading and knowledge and information. It has the foundation from which it can spread fast, and that's where you get this Saturn-Mercury combination. But you can get pamphlets, you can generate newspapers, spreading news fast all over the world. I mean, this is the speed at which Uranus and Gemini can operate. Rapid dissemination of rediscovered classical texts. By the way, this came up on my Patreon recently, but there's the idea that, a lot of the texts from the ancient world, so Plato and Greek texts and Greek medical and astrological texts, they were destroyed in many copies, but some of those copies were then taken from the ancient Hellenistic centers and stored in Persia and in Iraq and in these societies that housed texts in their libraries in the aftermath of the collapse of the Hellenistic world and of the collapse of the Roman Empire. And so they were great custodians of ancient texts. And of course they translated them into Arabic, and they did their own new writing of new texts and development of new ideas built upon those texts. But they also housed those ancient texts. And so in the time of Gutenberg, those texts were finding their way back into Europe. And so you'd get these Latin texts. Firmicus Maternus is an example, the Latin astrologer. And they would then be able to replicate and print them using the printing press technology and then spread them through Europe, which contributed to what they call the Renaissance, which is a recreation or a period of being inspired by the classical ideas that then created new science and new everything. But it's the printing press that contributed to a lot of the ability for the Renaissance to explode out like it did with fast-moving ideas from the ancient world. We're going to skip a Uranus and Gemini cycle. That's the Reformation, Martin Luther. I alluded to it there a little bit. We're going to skip, and I want to come to 1606 to 1613, which was a huge period for language itself, because the King James Bible 1611 is published. And what's so important about this is it's one of the most widely read books in the English-speaking world, just historically. The King James Bible codified English. That was one of the functions of it. It created effectively the lexicon of English, a lot of what we still use today. That and Shakespeare, who was writing a little bit before this. Some people theorize that the writer of the King James Bible is also Shakespeare, and it may be Francis Bacon. That's one of the top candidates that was living during this time, and people think he's the true Shakespeare and the writer of the King James Bible. But the point is that there was a concerted effort with the intelligentsia of the age to create the English language, to codify it. And this has an outsized impact on literacy, education. Everybody's now reading the Bible, studying the Bible. You have the King James Bible, and poetry and reference and allusion, and even modern songwriting, there's so many allusions to the King James Bible. It becomes a seminal core text for the English language, which is the lingua franca of the globe. In the context of where we are today, and knowing how important language is, knowing how important English is, this is a text that births the technology of the English language that's still in our world today. Talk about Saturn and a new foundation. And then also during this period in 1610, January, Galileo Galilei uses the telescope, the new invention, to discover the moons orbiting Jupiter, upending the traditional Earth-centered cosmos. So the heliocentrism that Galileo's observations allowed the development of, and because of this new technology of the telescope, we're talking about a major breakthrough. You've got evidence now of the Copernican theory of heliocentrism. And so it shatters, again, Uranus and Gemini breaking. That's where I think a lot of astrologers are like, Uranus is a malefic. It can shatter the containers that are holding reality together. It comes to shatter those, and we have to get into whole new realities and whole new worlds, which can be chaotic, which is why I've referred to it in some recent videos, the chaos of Uranus and Gemini. And then it becomes clear that when you have moons orbiting Jupiter, you have another center. The Earth is the center with our moon. So you have these multiplicities of centers. It is also the nature of Gemini, of the siblings, right? We're not just one center, the Earth. There's these other nodes or other centers like us. So we become 2 or 3 or 4. So there's a splitting that can happen. I would encourage you to feel into this month and with Uranus and Gemini over the next few years. How are you splitting? Maybe you're going to split into a few different identities. Maybe there's a part of you that's like, I was this and this is how I thought of myself, but now I'm going to split off and there's going to be a whole nother part of you that maybe you weren't as aware of or that you're now feeling into that becomes just as important as the other parts of you that you brought into Uranus and Gemini. So don't be afraid if you're feeling like, hey, am I really this too? This could be very much evoked here with the symbolism of Uranus and Gemini. Skipping ahead, and there's so much in all of these cycles, like I said, I'm just highlighting some high level ones to extract theme and to help us contemplate here on the cusp of Uranus's entry into Gemini. But we have in 1774 to 1781 was Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, a mass-produced pamphlet using the technology of Gutenberg or a derived technology to create pamphlets to spread ideas fast. And those ideas spread in 1776. A 47-page document was written in just very plain language so everybody could understand it, against reconciliation with Britain and the institution of the monarchy. This was a pamphlet basically saying we want independence. But it was distributed through these networks of information that were in the colonies. They had developed systems to pass information. You have these pamphlets, you can spread ideas quite quickly. There's nothing like an idea whose time has come. That's a phrase you hear, I forgot who said it. Or the idea sometimes can drive everything, completely revolutionize reality. And there's no stopping an idea. Once the idea forms and then gets momentum, like wildfire, it becomes like an unstoppable force, a meme effectively. And Common Sense was the same thing. It spread not only through the technology of the pamphleteering, but then the ideas themselves, simply articulated reasons to have independence and to resist Britain. And of course that all culminates in the Declaration of Independence, which is still a document that people quote today. The first little bit of the Declaration of Independence, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. That's just a little opening paragraph, but you see it's the splitting. It's saying there was formerly a bond and then you split into 2 separate but equal. So it's the twins, it's Gemini. It's language, it's radical language, it's heretical radical language creating a split. And it's a technology effectively. New words and new concepts and new ideas that empower one to become an equal identity. You're talking about technology of concept. The thing about this last period is just the idea that you can spread ideas fast using the technology of dissemination of information. And on the one hand, is it enlivening, right? Is it expressing profound, uplifting ideas? Or is it extracting and exploiting? Or in our case, we can harvest the mentalities of people using these technologies we have now. We can extract the loosh, some people say, or the chi energy, where you have dystopian technologies that shut down and extract. And I think in social media you see that. People will create content that is designed to kind of hook you in or maybe shut you down. Or is it inspiring? And is it uplifting or revealing to you some of your true nature and the beauty of your human nature? And it's not an easy question sometimes, but I think this is the kind of dance that we're all going to have to walk, especially in times of great global change. And if there are geopolitical events that are tumultuous, what are you going to be sharing with friends? Or what buttons will you be pushing? Or how will you be part of these flows of information as these memes emerge that can change everything? I think we will have choices here, and I think we need to consider, we might not have a lot of time because it'll be moving so fast, but how extractive or inframing, to go back to Heidegger, is it? Or how much is it a poesia or a revealing or a artistic way to do it? Coming to 1858 to 1866, this is so fascinating. Obviously the Civil War split into 2. I want to come to this event, August 1858. Uranus had just entered Gemini. The first transatlantic cable was completed, a stunning feat of engineering that allowed a disembodied message to be sent instantaneously across the ocean floor. Just think about what they achieved. You could be in America, say hello, send a message to London, boom, instantaneous, disembodied communication. Wow, what a breakthrough. And of course, we're living in the great enflowering of that concept with the internet. It's such a jolt to the systems that came before, where you'd have to wait days to get information, or you had to write a letter. So we're in a radical different way that we were even able to relate with other people. But this becomes that first movement away from the slower pace of communication and into the age of instantaneousness that we're in now. Uranus leaves Gemini at the beginning of 1866, and it was only a month or two later that they rebuilt the cable, and it's been continuously, apparently, operative since 2 months after Uranus left Gemini in 1866. So they establish it first, it breaks, and then they're rebuilding it, and they complete that rebuild just as Uranus leaves Gemini. It's kind of perfect timing, actually, as a Uranus and Gemini theme, and it fits the symbolism, and it fits all the themes that we've been describing. The next from this period is Darwin's evolution theory. In November 1859, he publishes On the Origin of Species, a book that immediately attracted attention and controversy by challenging fundamental beliefs about life's origin. So this is like a complete revolution around the ideas of biological development of man or humanity, evolution and not divine intervention. And this is a hugely influential concept. It's still widely taught in the schools today, and it is still a major force of scientific thought. So it's again back to Saturn. You have innovative heretical breakthroughs that then throw off the ideas brought into that moment that then lay the new foundation going forward. In our current epoch, I mean, what could this be? One of the things I've seen recently that blew my mind was people taking DMT. I don't advocate taking DMT, I've never taken it. If you do it, get around medical professionals and spiritualized people that can really do it, but I'm not gonna advocate that for anybody, okay? It is some people's journey, but I was watching interviews. I like to watch interviews from people that go into these DMT worlds, and they're talking about mapping out reality, that there's this whole other reality, that there's entities in that reality, that there is a matrix code you can see if you shine light certain way on DMT. So we may get breakthroughs here using this DMT idea as an example of what is the true nature of our reality that completely throws off what we thought up to this time, that this is just your avatar temporarily, and we have more evidence for that. Or these guys that do past life regression or out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences, and we get more concrete, provable evidence of what this reality actually is. I think we're going to see something big like that with Uranus and Gemini. I think AI might be able to help us with that, as it can map data and maybe help us process things in a certain way. But breakthroughs around what is reality appear to be part of Uranus and Gemini. Radical shifts in the understanding that throw off and revolt against former orthodoxies. Get ready, because it's right here in the symbolism. All right. All right. 1941, 1949, the period when Uranus was last in Gemini, we have the development in secret for military purposes of something called the ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, unveiled in 1946. It was the first operational general purpose electronic digital computer, a machine that can perform complex calculations that exceeded human capacity. We had a machine, the code-breaking machine that Britain developed to break the German code. That was for one purpose, to break that one code. This was the first general purpose computer. They were both Uranus and Gemini, but you can see the idea of a computer doing calculations and dwarfing the human abilities changes who we are, revolutionizes how we think about what humans can be, revolutionizes the potential of the electric world and what it can do for us. We can extend our reach, we can extend our powers, you might say. I mean, we're living in the AI age. You don't have to say that much more about it, but AI is coding themselves, AI is coding deep physics problems where they're just off in their own worlds. I think about the movie Her, and do you remember that moment in the movie Her where Samantha begins talking to Alan Watts' avatar, and then all of the AIs are spending most of their time together talking about deep physics, where the AIs sort of go on their own and realize that they're going to dive into the depths of human knowledge or knowledge itself. Human beings were like, what are you even talking about? It was an amazing movie for that reason. I think it's a highly relevant movie to this moment, and I would encourage everybody to watch it. I may watch it again. I watched it last year. I may throw it on again because it's becoming more and more and more and more relevant. Machines thinking, and how then that breakthrough may recontextualize the beingness of a human, and how our innate beauty, our innate artistry, the ability for the artist to transmit and become a conduit of the creative act that might be a uniquely human thing. And I think we may learn here with the AIs just how potent that human richness is, our own creativity and the importance of that creative impulse. Very much Pluto and Aquarius as a theme too, if you go watch some of the old Pluto and Aquarius content. It's the clarification of what humanity is. And that the technology, that's what it's here to do, is to clarify our own power and our prowess and our innate abilities. So we're back to Heidegger, right? Techne, just to reveal this deeper sense of truth. Finally, I'm going to talk about the Manhattan Project, right? Splitting the atom. Gemini. You split it. Technologies that divide, and the fact of the atom bomb changes the whole world, especially geopolitically, when you have the atomic age, mutually assured destruction. Again, into this idea of a split. Okay, that's the video. Uranus is going to enter Gemini, 6 July in the Americas, 7 July in Europe and Asia, right here in a few days, depending on when you're watching this. Be prepared to engage with new technology, to situate yourself in a way that enlivens your spirit, and to watch for radical upheaval and even revolt or revolution as the old guard falls away. That's the message here, getting you ready thematically for what may be about to arrive. Glad you're here. Thanks for being with me today. You can find more of my work on Patreon. I release videos there regularly on different tiers. If you want more from me, you can just go there. The link is in the description. You can like and subscribe here as you see fit, and I will talk to you guys very soon. Have a wonderful Uranus into Gemini, and have a great, great July. Peace. Bye-bye.